Hello everyone, I'm Michelle Allen from the Chartered Banker Institute. Thank you all for joining us today on Managing Cultural Risk, and I also welcome today's expert presenter, Sandro. Sandro has worked as a corporate governance professional in banking for many years, and he now runs Risk Audit, which is a professional development company. Over the last 5 years, he has researched and lectured on the impact of culture in banking and the lessons that can be learnt from the past. And today, we're pleased that he's sharing some of those findings with us. If you do have any questions for Sandro, please submit them via the online form, and he will answer as many as possible at the end of his presentation. Now, I'll hand over to Sandro to start that presentation. Thank you, Sandro.
Michelle, thank you very much for that wonderful introduction, and also thank you very much for pronouncing my name correctly, normally a challenge too far. The subject of culture, and specifically culture in banking, is a subject that I find deeply frustrating for no other reason than it's taken me 35 odd years to discover it. What do I mean by that? I've been working in the banking sector in one capacity or another for about 40 years. 35 years was spent believing that people would always do the right thing, behave logically, look after their customers, look after the business. It's 5 years ago that I actually realised that we're dealing with unpredictable, emotional, creative human beings. So, really, today's talk is about trying to bring some framework to managing the possibility that we have an inappropriate culture in our banking or financial services institution. We have a good business reason for dealing with this challenge. The banking industry has missold pensions, mortgages, insurance products, interest rate swaps. Bankers have been engaged in insider trading and market manipulation. Bankers have admitted and been named, shamed and fined for actually manipulating interest rates such as LIBOR. So the question that I ask is, do we want a culture associated with that picture in front of you, which is taken from the Wolf of Wall Street, or do we want a culture which will lead to our business being sustainable, serving our customers properly, and hopefully in a profitable manner? We need to understand some of the root causes of cultural problems in banking. First of all, I'm inviting you to accept that at heart, because we are human beings, we are all inherently greedy. Greed is not something we should necessarily be ashamed of, but it's something that we need to manage, because when greed becomes excessive, the problems that I've just referred to occur. But let's be clear that there were other root causes of these cultural problems. There was the fact that perhaps management didn't understand the business. The fact that human beings, generally speaking, like following herds. The fact that some human beings like a certain status in society. The fact that different stakeholders placed differing degrees of pressure on people to behave in a certain way. So my first challenge to yourselves is to invite you to ask the question, do we really understand what the root causes are of the behaviours in our organisation? Please, 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 let's not assume that one size fits all. Different organisations, different people are actually driven by different root causes. The response to these cultural issues has been to name, shame and fine organisations, with the UK regulators perhaps being amongst the most aggressive. In some organisations, licences have been threatened, And in fact, in one particular organisation, a licence was suspended in the United States. A number of bankers have been jailed. Bonuses are being clawed back. We're now seeing more and more rules. We're encouraging human beings to blow the whistle. And we are in fact creating a surveillance society. The picture on this slide says, just say no to negativity. Can I invite you to go back to those wonderful days when you were positive, when the world was your oyster, when you felt inspired? If somebody had tried to make a business case to you about the way you should behave, given your mood at that time, I suspect you would have been more inclined to listen. The point I'm trying to make is, does a mood, an aura of negativity really lead to the right behaviours and the right responses in the longer term? A little bit of basic psychology. I believe that the current environment in banking leads to an environment of fear. Any psychologist will tell you that where there is fear, 3 F's typically follow. These F's have been programmed inside us and date back to the days when we were being chased by dinosaurs. Now, whilst there are no dinosaurs in the City of London, that human programming still exists. So either we fight, that's F number 1, we engage in corporate politics, or we flee, which in the corporate world means we mentally flee the scene of the problem and try and convince ourselves that malpractice is not occurring, or we freeze. We're so scared that we actually fail to react at all. We engage in complete and utter indecision. I have plenty of circumstantial evidence to indicate that many of my clients at the moment are responding classically to this fear factor and engaging in politics, fleeing, or freezing. Is that really what we want? I'd like to introduce you to the cultural risk management framework. Like any risk management framework, the first challenge is to define the risk that we are trying to manage. In the context of today, the risk that we're trying to manage is the risk of inappropriate behaviour. The problem and challenge that we have is, what exactly do we mean by inappropriate? In my opinion, inappropriate needs to be judged in the context of all of our stakeholders, our shareholders, our customers, our employees, even the media, but certainly the regulator. I would like you to focus on the fact that stakeholder perceptions change through time. What is appropriate today may not be deemed appropriate in terms of behaviour in 6 months' time to 12 months' time. So whatever mechanism we use to assess the risk that we're facing in terms of culture, that mechanism needs to be very dynamic to take into account the perspectives of our stakeholder. In terms of risk, we're looking for a framework that allows us to influence behaviour. More in a moment. We need obviously to understand what culture is. When I look at culture, I think of culture using the 4 C's. You'd expect a consultant to have a 4 C's. The first dimension is what we call create culture, sometimes referred to as entrepreneurialism. I will ask you to reflect on whether you believe banks, for example, need to be entrepreneurial. I certainly do. So we need to make sure that we have organisations that encourage appropriate salesmanship, appropriate relationship management, appropriate product development, but encourage that entrepreneurialism within boundaries stipulated by stakeholders. The second aspect that I would like you to consider is what we refer to as clan collaborate, sometimes referred to as team culture. To what degree does your organisation want to foster the concept of team? The third C refers to as compete culture, sometimes referred to as market culture. Do you want to benchmark what you do against the outside world, or do you want to focus on your own world view, full stop? And finally, there is the aspect of culture that we are becoming very accustomed to, control culture, sometimes referred to as risk culture. I hate to say, but most of the conversation since the global financial crisis has been on making sure our organisations have enough risk culture. The problem is this debate has perhaps been to the detriment on focusing on the balance of the other three C's. So, we're talking about a risk management framework. We're talking about the need for the board, the senior management team, to define the optimal culture that your bank needs to achieve its corporate objectives. Having defined that culture, we're looking at a mechanism for measuring it. The methodology for measuring culture, well, there are many methodologies. Just as there are many credit risk measurement methodologies and market risk measurement methodologies, there are many cultural measurement methodologies. The methodology I want to refer to today that works from our perspective is referred to as the Organisational Cultural Assessment Instrument. More about this in a moment. Having defined the culture we want, having measured the culture we have, most organisations will be in the process of needing to transform their culture. And we'll talk about some of the cultural transformation points in a moment. And finally, because as I said earlier on, we live in a highly dynamic world, we need from time to time to review the culture we have in the context of what will undoubtedly be changing stakeholder perceptions. How do you measure culture? Well, you first of all need to have a methodology which has been accepted by the risk management community. I would argue that the corporate psychologist is potentially what I would call a new age quant in today's banking world. Having invited our corporate psychologist, whether this is done on an outsourcing basis or by hiring one or two, we have to approve the methodology. Typically, the methodology will exist of a set of questions. The questions will be delivered using structured surveys or focus groups or questionnaires. The important point is that the questions that seek data on culture are tailored to the environment in question. So, if I'm measuring culture in a retail bank, I'm going to be asking a very different set of questions than if I was to measure the culture of a wholesale dealing room, say in the foreign exchange markets. But I do not just accept what people tell me. I validate the data. So, for example, if somebody tells me that this organisation is a mentoring and nurturing organisation, I ask people for examples. I try and find inconsistencies in what people are saying to make sure that corporate politics are not skewing the output of my cultural measurement exercise. In measuring culture, we tend to focus on 6 key dimensions. So let me quickly outline them. First of all, we look at the strategic emphasis of the organisation. What's it focused on? Is it growing? Is it in a mature market? What are the cultural essences of strategy. What are the dominant characteristics of the organisation? Is it a flat structure where everybody is listened to? Is it a deeply hierarchical structure? Leadership is so important to culture. Most of you will have heard the term tone at the top. You would not be surprised if I was to say to you that we measure the type of leadership that is influencing perspectives in the organisation. But leadership differs from management. Management is an organisational set of processes. So we look at the way management is organised. We also look at what we refer to as the organisational glue. What, if anything, binds a group of people together to create the team and the culture that we are seeking to manage? And the final aspect that we measure is we look at the processes and the criteria that is used to deal with success. So what constitutes success in your bank? How is it measured? What impact does achieving success actually have? What you'll see in front of you is a diagram. It's a diagram with a picture and with numbers. Now, I make no apology for trying to translate something which is very grey and amorphous, culture, into something that fits into the risk management dashboards of a modern bank or financial services institution. This diagram gives a picture of the culture of whatever we've measured here. So, what we have here is a moderately balanced culture. The collaborate rating, which is about 32, indicates a strong team culture. We have a strong control culture, a moderately creative entrepreneurial culture, and a moderately external facing culture. Now, I don't know whether that diagram bears any relationship to your own organisation. In transforming culture, the next challenge is to decide what the trade-offs are. Do we want more of one of the C's or less of one of the C's? So let me share with you some very typical trade-offs. Most organisations do not really understand or focus on the fact that they are indeed trading off one or more aspects of culture for other aspects of culture. It's just happening. So a cultural risk management framework organises a debate where the nature of the trade-offs are actually debated. You will be not surprised to learn that control culture impedes create culture. If I want a truly entrepreneurial bank, then the less controls I have in place, the less bureaucratic they are, the less of them that exist, the more authority I give to people, the more of a create culture I've got. Control potentially stifles creativity. But control also stifles potentially team culture. What do I mean by that? One form of control is authorization. If I introduce authorization controls, I'm stipulating what people can and cannot do. If I remove authorization from more junior people and I restrict that authorization to a small group of senior people, it could be argued that I am enhancing the control culture of the organization. But what psychological message am I giving to the team? The taking away of authority, the introduction of red tape, is actually saying to a team, I don't trust you. And because trust is such an important ingredient in any family, or for that matter, any team, there is a risk that control culture introduced inappropriately potentially destroys teams. And I have to say, we are seeing some of those outcomes with many of my clients at this point in time. Now, managing culture is not a black and white activity. It's an iterative activity. It's an activity that requires experimentation. But before we experiment, we do need to collect some more data. What actually drives behaviour in our organisation? The conventional wisdom amongst regulators is that remuneration, with very heavy emphasis on variable pay, is the key conduct driver. But is that really the case? I was talking to a trader about 3 weeks ago in the City of London. This gentleman last year had made about $10 million for himself. I asked him if he was motivated by money. His answer was, not at all. I have all of the money that I need. I'm actually motivated by competing. So, I'd like to refer you back to your early educational days when you looked at Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Money is sometimes a motivator, depending on other factors. Other factors which can motivate people include pride, pride in serving a customer well, loss of face, working in an inspirational, creative environment, aspiring for promotion, having a degree of control on one's job and job content. There are many, many behavioural drivers. We need to understand them if we're then going to engage in a process of transformation. There are certain areas of focus in the transformation projects that we see. Leadership is obviously important. I'd like to make two comments. First of all, there are leadership assessment tools. These are corporate psychological tools, frequently referred to as psychometric tests, that allow organizations to assess whether a particular prospective leader is the right person to lead a process of change. Tone at the top is important, but tone at the top is only important if it is supported by consistent actions. I always say to clients that just because you've given a speech or just because you've shared in a town hall, you need to walk the talk. The policies and procedures that flow from your speech, your own actions, the actions of your senior management team have to be consistent with the cultural transformation that you are seeking to achieve. Recruitment is another hotspot. It's important that in your job specifications you outline the personal characteristics of a human being that you are looking for. It's important that your recruitment vetting processes actually check that the human beings that you're about to let in through the gate actually really do possess the personal characteristics that you need. So, if I want to recruit an aggressive trader or aggressive salesperson, I'm clearly going to profile an individual using psychometric tests, using questioning about their CV and their past to see if that's what I'm going to get. If I want an extremely control cultural focused individual, I'm going to ask a different set of questions. So my challenge to people listening today is, to what degree have your recruitment processes been modified to conduct the cultural test before you let somebody into your organisation? Education is important. Education is about training, so it's about having appropriate training tools. It's about making sure that the message that people are given during the training is linked to the tone at the top. What I would say is that training that uses the power of storytelling is the most compelling form of training. I'm going to share with you some storytelling in the moment involving a person that's quite dear to my heart. All training should be accompanied by measurement. What I mean by measurement is not how many hours did you spend on that course, or could you please sign a document to show that you attended the course, but training that actually validates whether the learning objectives of a cultural transformation piece of work have actually been achieved. You will not be surprised to know and to understand that performance management processes are also important. Your staff appraisal, management appraisal, board appraisal processes are critical in analysing behaviour during a given period of time versus what was expected. But education, performance management without some form of consequences framework is a waste of time. Without consequences, human beings will not be persuaded to change. I hope that I've made the business case for the design of positive stimuli wherever possible. Stimuli which are linked to what drives behaviour in your own organisation. We're starting to see all sorts of balanced scorecards in the industry, that is to say, appraisal mechanisms that look at behaviour and have an impact on somebody's pay. The problem with these balanced scorecards is that the consequences are almost universally negative. Let me give you an example of a positive consequences framework. I was recently working with an internal audit function in Sydney, or to be precise, in the beautiful Blue Mountains just outside Sydney. I was the master of ceremonies, so to speak, for their annual conference. The audit function decided to reward the most innovative audit issue. Now, why? Because they wanted their auditors to be lateral thinking, innovative people, and they wanted to introduce a consequence. The consequence was a positive. The positive was actually a trip to Fiji for the auditor that won the prize, as well as his or her family. Now, let's not get carried away. Fiji is not that far from Sydney, but it's pleasant. You might be surprised to learn that the winner of the contest was somebody who came up with an audit issue that actually never ever made an audit report. What management wanted to do was to praise innovation. It's the process of innovation that they wanted to praise. So, a real challenge to perhaps relook at your consequences framework, to perhaps start to introduce the carrots as well as the stick. I had a fascinating conversation along these lines with a UK regulator about 12 months ago. This regulator was starting to realise that just naming, shaming, fining institutions is perhaps not the only tool that regulators can use to transform behaviour in the industry. I like to think of artefacts. Artefacts are symbolic. So this is an invitation perhaps to look at the artefacts that you use to transform behaviour in your workplace. Now clearly money is an artefact. The amount of money you pay people on a fixed term basis, salary, is an artefact. Bonuses are artefacts. Stock options are artefacts. Regulators have been using fines as artefacts. They've been using capital hits by increasing Basel II capital as an artefact. You are now starting to see the beginnings of debate in the regulatory community where regulators are questioning whether reducing capital and actually telling the world that they've reduced capital as an incentive, a positive incentive towards behaviour, is now starting to be debated. That will be a great day. Maybe we're not quite there yet. Working spaces are interesting artefacts. So, for example, if I want people to collaborate, if I want more of a team culture, I'm clearly going to design an open space working environment where human beings are encouraged to actually talk and collaborate with each other as opposed to an office environment. Team bonding initiatives is another example of artefacts. So you have an invitation to look at the symbolism that is so important in business and in the human condition. How is symbolism used to try and transform behaviour in your organisations? I said that this was a framework, and frameworks have governance, or the word governance, attached to them. So, a few quick observations about this particular framework. First of all, who owns it? Should it be the Chief Executive Officer? Should it perhaps be a strategic Chief Operating Officer? Or what about the HR function? In the United Kingdom, the new senior managers regime has two prescribed responsibilities. One of them is leading the development of culture. The second one is embedding culture. The framework requires banks and designated investment firms to allocate that responsibility to one of two senior managers, either the chairman of your organisation or the chief executive officer of your organisation. Now, if I'm the chief executive of a bank of 250,000 people and I have that responsibility, how do I defend myself from accusations that I've been incompetent? Well, I would argue I create a framework. So in this slide pack, if you will pardon the arrogance, you potentially have the key steps and key dimensions of a framework that can be owned by the chief executive, and that the chief executive can show to the regulator to show that he or she has done their best to manage cultural risk. I believe the role of the first line in this framework is to define the optimal cultural profile, and having defined it, to actually execute the activities that have been agreed that will transform your culture into either a more control-conscious culture, or a more entrepreneurial culture, or a balanced culture, or whatever, depending on what you need. I would argue that the role of the second line is to, first of all, measure culture. So, I'd love to say it's best market practice. It isn't yet, but it's evolving. It's perhaps giving responsibility to a function such as HR and tasking them with developing business-as-usual tools that can be used to measure culture. I also believe that the role of the second line of defence, who do I mean? The risk management functions, credit, market, operational risk, compliance, is to actually challenge the relationships and dilemmas that exist. So, for example, is there a disconnect between what the stakeholders want, what the objectives of the corporation are, and the desired culture? Most organisations will have that disconnect. In fact, some organisations, for example, state-owned organisations, that disconnect is built into the board. The board is responsible to perhaps a state that wants the organisation to be risk-less, don't lose me any more money, and a board that is also accountable to a stakeholder that wants to sell that organisation in return for a large return. Well, that requires creativity and entrepreneurialism. I believe that the role of the second line is to escalate to the board any of the following situations. Number one, if you have no framework, shouldn't the second line of defence be screaming? Can I ask you to rhetorically reflect on whether your organisation has a framework along the lines of what I've described? If the answer is not quite, why hasn't somebody screamed? To answer that question by saying, well, nobody else in the industry has a framework, why do we need to build one? Is that really a good enough answer? Are we not trying to create an industry where there are leaders who will sometimes take a risk? Guys, let's remove the herd mentality and let's engage in a degree of thought leadership. So I really would like to challenge all people on this session that are sitting in the second line of defence. If you believe your organisation doesn't have a framework, then escalate. If you believe that the actions that your organisation are taking are inconsistent with its cultural objectives, then I believe the role of the second line of defence, once again, is to escalate. The role of the third line, internal audit perhaps, is to ask a number of questions. Is there a framework? Is it clear who owns and who is accountable for this framework? Has the organisation stipulated its optimal cultural profile, and is that profile aligned with its corporate objectives and the expectations of its wide and varied stakeholders? Does the organisation have a measurement methodology? Is the methodology appropriate? Are the results that flow from the act of measurement actioned? Does the organisation have a number of transformational cultural projects? Are they consistent with the cultural objectives of the organisation? Now, I would argue that most internal audit functions asking those questions will have things to say, will have recommendations to make. But why do we not see these recommendations being made? Once again, it's the herd instinct. The fact that this cultural risk management framework is not yet best market practice doesn't mean that it is not appropriate market practice. So, let me try and look at the upside of this debate. First of all, we always talk about the 3 lines of defence philosophy, and that the first line of defence is responsible for everything. By implication, that means the first line of defence should be risk control experts. Do we really mean that? To me, culture is about having an appropriate balance between creative people. I'm not saying people that are not risk aware. All people should be risk aware. But creative people will sometimes be less risk sensitive. We need to get the right balance between risk sensitivity and risk control. It may be difficult for you to envisage what I'm about to say, but the time will come when the regulator is not the most dominant stakeholder. Banks need to sell to survive. Please let me be very clear. Banks must not missell to survive. Banks must not misrepresent to survive, but banks need to sell to survive. Selling is not a dirty word. Let's not let history contaminate our future. Having this type of framework provides an early warning indicator of cultural imbalances. I would argue that if the chart that I shared with you, the cultural profile I shared with you, was a chart that was produced at regular intervals, not on the whole organisation, but on the pressure points, monitoring trends on that chart that are derived from that chart should be a perfect opportunity to take early action if the culture is turning out to be inappropriate. Who should we give the task of creating this framework to? Please, please, please give it to a proactive individual, somebody that is most likely to take a balanced approach to culture. Otherwise, we will have the negative, product-stifling, innovation-stifling frameworks that are currently being created in the industry. I said that the power of storytelling is important. This gentleman is a shoemaker. This gentleman is my father. Now, why am I introducing my father into a webcast being broadcast to the financial services sector? Because my father has a transformational effect on me. He has an emotional effect on me. He's part of my DNA. How are you building that bridge in your training material, in your organisations? If you want to transform culture, you need to engage with the emotions of the human beings that you are employing. There is a saying that the longest journey in banking is about 20 centimetres. It's the distance from somebody's head to somebody's heart. Now, I've used this picture in some transformational cultural training in the commercial banking division of one of the UK's largest banks. All I'm trying to do is to get the human beings to make an emotional attachment and to reflect on the behaviours that they would like to engage in if they do not want to treat people close to them badly. So, whether that picture is of an inspiring customer, an inspiring stakeholder, an inspiring regulator maybe even, or your mother or father or guardian or child, doesn't matter, but the emotional link is absolutely essential. That concludes my presentation for today. Obviously, I'm singing from my supper, so to speak. What does risk audit do in this particular space? Well, we facilitate leadership discussions designed to help organisations work out the culture they need. We also engage in helping organisations measure culture. We train teams on managing cultural risk in banking using this particular framework. And we also work in the introduction of cultural transformation methodologies. I would invite you to look at my website, riskaudit.com. I'm going to be handing over to Michelle in a moment, who will be talking about some attachments that have connections with our website, but also a cultural widget, the opportunity to engage in a bit of game playing and perhaps measure your culture on the back of an envelope. So that concludes my presentation. I'm now going to hand back to Michelle, and we'll obviously take questions.
Yes. Thank you very much, Sandro. One of the things that really got me thinking was when we looked at your artifact slide and you suggested people talking to each other. Shock horror, that's radical.
I think, Michelle, it's if you look at the physical conditions that encourage people to talk to each other, it's quite important. That's on the presumption that people are working with each other in a physical environment.
Yes.
Barriers to communication. For example, the layout of a meeting room has an impact on culture.
Yes.
We need to work harder with today's email-orientated society, obviously.
Indeed. Yes, I've talked to some colleagues who work elsewhere who said that people who sit opposite each other would sooner send emails, and the key question is, why? Just talk. That's a big one for me. And you also mentioned the attachments tab, and our listeners will find the slide pack available on here. So one of the key takeouts is the actual framework that Sandro's talked through during his presentation, and you'll also find links to the risk audit website and indeed the widget tool that Sandro mentioned. And we do have some good questions coming in that I may pose to you, Sandro. Do you believe that regulators, for example, the Banking Standards Board, should define what good culture looks like, e.g. minimum standards for banks?
No. And let me justify the answer to the question, no. I do not believe that there is that one size fits all is an appropriate approach to take in a democratic, creative society. I also believe that if we try and create a one-size-fits-all approach to what constitutes an appropriate culture, then we are potentially going to remove the innovation which is so necessary in our sector. What I would rather say is I believe that regulators should define, using principles-based language, the essential aspects of a cultural risk management framework, just as they would define the essential characteristics of a credit risk management framework, But I believe it gets dangerous when regulators interfere with how much risk anybody can take. That's not to say that regulators shouldn't use their own consequences framework to try and manipulate or influence behaviour. They already use capital adequacy criteria, liquidity criteria, fines, etc. My other plea is I wish they would use some more positive stimulus to try and get the right result for reasons I've explained.
And sort of following on from that question, do you believe that the human behaviour can be subjected to a control framework?
Yes. I think we've got to be a little bit creative in our use of words. Anybody that has a teenage child will know that they can influence behaviour. I'm about to contradict myself, frequently using money. The fact that they're using these tools, to me, indicates that they're using some form of framework. The answer for me is that human risk is too important not to be managed. Managing a risk means identifying its nature, measuring the exposure, and then trying to manage it. So for all of those reasons, given the importance of the risk and given that all of these characteristics can be applied to behaviour, my answer is most definitely yes, Michelle. I do believe that human risk can be managed. And if manage is too strong a word for the more liberal palate, then I would argue influenced.
And how far do you feel that sort of codes of professional conduct go to assist towards?
To me, codes of professional conduct serve two purposes. Number one, they act as the basis of training material. So the industry coming up with codes and hopefully coming up with compelling interactive training material is telling the industry a story as to the behaviour that they believe would hold the industry in a good position. Secondly, codes also then act as a benchmarking basis for a consequences framework.
Yeah.
What I would like to see, however, Michelle, are organisations praised for behaving in compliance with codes.
Yes.
So Banking Standards Board, for example, is going to use a peer review mechanism. My hope is that they don't only talk about the organisations that are misbehaving,
yes,
but they also praise the organisations that are behaving very well. That will have positive consequences.
So we see the good examples as well as the bad examples.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that balance is critical. Otherwise, all we do is create more of a fear factor.
Yes, yes, I would agree with that. And that brings us to the end of our questions. So thank you very much, Sandro.
My pleasure.
And I'd like to thank everybody for listening. And as we mentioned, today's presentation, along with Sandro's details and links to additional information, are all available on the Attachments tab. And I'd like to ask that you use the ratings buttons and you leave your feedback for today's presentation. And please join us on June the 28th for our next webcast on the banking certification regime, which will be my last one before I leave the Institute. So thank you, everybody. Enjoy your day and goodbye. Thanks.
Thank you.